the first thump of dirt is emotional. That's the worst,
right?
For me at least. And then that last bit, when you can't see it any longer, there's a really emotional experience there, and it's hard to describe, but it matters.
A lot of people have 2, 3, 4 weddings. You only ever have one funeral per person, because I think it's very meaningful to kind of, send your loved one out with the blessings for the new generation and kind of take part in the fact that the return of this body to the earth is going to give life to future life forms in this spot that's being preserved for nature.
This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
Hi, everybody. My guest today, Emily B. Miller, is leading the movement toward a more sustainable and meaningful approach to death care. She's the founder of Colorado Burial, Preserve, and Cremation Garden, a licensed funeral director, and a life cycle celebrant who specializes in personalized secular ceremonies. Emily also serves on the board of the Green Burial Council, where she helps drive education and advocacy for natural burial. And put differently, what that means is that if you're interested in learning about green burial, Emily is the person that you need to know. Emily, it's great to have you here today.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here.
Yes. So before we dive in, can you share a little bit about your journey, what led you to work in the funeral industry, what ultimately led you to become an advocate for green burial? Because it is a pretty specific genre of the industry.
Yeah, it's a niche I'm in for sure, and that's cemetery humor, because we call it a niche when cremated remains have a little spot in the cemetery. I first became aware of funeral service as a possible profession because my background, I actually have a bachelor's degree in world religions. But I didn't want to sort of stay in academia, and it wasn't theology degree like to be a pastor. So I was pursuing creative endeavors. I was in the hand knitting industry when I started to have passion fatigue, burnout around making my creative endeavors my work. And so I realized that I could, at the community college in my city, go back to school for funeral service, and that it would actually make use of my background and my interest in the religions of the world. And I didn't really have a whole lot of exposure to death and dying, nor to funerals, other than, kind of low-key having buried my great-grandfather as a child sort of exposures. But a lot of comfortable overlap between questions of faith, questions of why communities work together the way they do, and the issues we face at end of life. I first encountered natural burial as an option. First I ever heard about it was when I was in mortuary college studying all the options. It was like funeral directing options. That was the curriculum. And they assigned us as reading Grave Matters by Mark Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an immediate, emotional response to the idea of a final resting place in nature. It seemed so different to me than the manicured, man-made ways that our cemeteries are sort of built up and managed. And I thought, wow, when you think of returning to the cycle, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, to have this happen in a place that's by and for nature is so different than, what we just think of at a conventional cemetery service. So I entered the conventional funeral and cemetery career. I was lucky enough to work at a cemetery where we operated a traditional Jewish portion of the cemetery. It was owned by the local synagogue, but managed by the cemetery that was my employer. And so at that time when I was an intern in funeral service and really just learning the business, I was exposed to these traditional Jewish graveside services, which are, of course, so natural burial is when everything is biodegradable, there's been no embalming, so there's nothing to sort of hasten or delay the return of the body to the processes that will take it back to the soil. All the wrappings or coverings or containers are biodegradable, be it a shroud, unfinished wood casket. There's all sort of intermediate containers like willow baskets and these renewable materials. So anyway, the Jewish and the Islamic funeral services are very similar to what we now call green burial. They've always just called it burial because by their faith, they prefer this, neither hasten nor delay the return of the body. Don't use these impervious containers. So anyway, I was lucky to be able to be exposed to some of these funerals from other cultures, which reminded me a lot of what we now call green burial, which is, we call it that as to center the environmental sustainability aspects of it. But there's a lot of reasons why people might choose that type of disposition, and being environmentally friendly, I'm finding, is really only one of them.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. So a lot of people don't realize how industrialized, how resource-heavy traditional burial processes have become and are currently. What do they need to know about that? What is one of the things that surprises most people when you start having conversations with them?
Well, the one surprise I hear a lot is that people assume, because they've not been taught otherwise, or because the conventional cemeteries would love for them to be under the impression that you have to have some of this extra stuff by law, and that there must be some law requiring us to go forward with embalming and with caskets and vaults and etc. When, as I said, these religious cultures have been practicing this style of burial the whole time. They just call it burial. When you're in a situation where a funeral director is telling you, yeah, we really have to go forward with embalming, or when a cemetery is saying, a vault and outer burial container is required, those are typically company policies. This is not a local law saying all burial has to be done with the protective qualities of a vault. The cemeteries use the vaults, firstly, because they make a margin. A part of their profits is wrapped up in the sale of the vault. And secondly, because it simplifies the mowing. In the cemetery, the vault helps create a nice, flat, stable surface, so that when they're setting up for a funeral, there's no footing kind of issues. And when they're mowing and weed whacking, it's as straightforward and therefore as cost effective as possible.
So if they didn't use a vault over time, if it was a wooden casket, it would collapse in and there'd be a divot there above, correct?
When we do, yes. So the process that takes the body back to the soil will eventually have some settling. And if you ever go to a real old historical cemetery like pre-Civil War, sometimes you might see these divots. It almost looks like someone has been dug up. But in fact, when we bury a casket, there's an air gap between the top of the person's body and the bottom of the casket lid. And eventually, depending on what material it is, depending on the soil and weather conditions, there will be a collapse. Combination of that and just the reducing of surface area of the mass of the person as it is reintegrated into the soil, you do, and you can get this divot. However, in a natural burial, we don't extract anything from the site. We want all that earth that we removed to go back to the soil, and it leaves a mound. At a conventional cemetery, they don't want to leave a mound, and so they have to take away all of the earth that's displaced by the mass of whatever you've buried. It's kind of like water out of a bathtub. They have to take the spillover away, and they pile it up in the maintenance area of their yard. So cemeteries use vaults to avoid having the divot form in the future, but every cemetery on the planet has excess earth from digging holes, and it's very possible to peel back the sod, top up the earth to a level ground, and replace the sod and water it again if you do have an irrigated cemetery. So the vault is to prevent the divot, but there's other ways to prevent the divot. And in a natural burial, the mound itself is what prevents the divot. You have sort of the combination of those processes happening with the body and common erosion, the weathering of time affecting the top of the mound. And so over time, it's going to sort of neutralize and look as if, we're trying to have it look as if the earth was never disturbed.
So if you have a vault, to understand, you remove the dirt, the vault goes in, casket inside the vault closes up, dirt back on top, they remove the extra, perfectly flat. Green burial, natural burial, you end up with the mound of earth that you removed on top, but over time that just settles back into place itself, and it's as if nothing was there in the first place.
Yeah, or if there is some, trace of a mound or depression left, in a best case scenario, it's being managed for native habitat and beneficial, locally adapted plant species. So this little bit of extra topography that's now being experienced in this area, it might collect water when it rains. It might be a resource for the plants and animals that are seeking nutrients in this environment. So to have a bit of a mound or a bit of a depression is really, it's in keeping with conservation management of the earth anyway.
Yeah. It seems like green burial isn't just an eco-friendly trend anymore. It's almost as if it's a return to something that's deeply human. And yet for a lot of people, I don't think it's even on their radar. Why do you think that is?
I agree with you that this is a return to ancestral practices. And I think one of the reasons we've lost sight of it in recent generations is you had the rise of the cemetery and funeral industry. It's been professionalized and commoditized. By that, I mean, before roughly the Civil War era in the US, death similar to illness and pregnancy and birth, all of these would have been handled in the home and by the community. And, you had multiple generations of family living together. And if someone died, it was common to have them laid out in the home until everyone could come and pay their respects. And then the same community of people who knew them in life would take care of their final needs of carrying them off to the burial ground and participating in saying goodbye and making this last act of care of disposing of the body. So the profession of funeral directing and the manufacturing network of merchandise that goes along with it came about around the time of the Civil War. Embalming was invented sort of in response to the needs for the wealthy northern families to have their battlefield dead brought back home before burial. This would have been a multi-day train journey. And of course, young men dead of trauma would have been in rough shape from being, outdoors and dead from trauma and the slow ride home. So yeah, embalming was invented as a consumer product to meet the need of these people who wanted greater more mobility to not have their sons be buried far from home. And after that, you have industrialization in the United States, meaning urbanization as well. You have the kind of slow dissolution of the multi-general household in favor of people moving to the cities to get factory jobs and all of this. So there's no longer a front parlor. You need a funeral parlor because now we're living in, tenement apartments. Same thing with when you're in the city, you need someone with a vehicle or a horse-drawn conveyance to get your person out to the cemetery. This is no longer just over the hill in the churchyard. So yeah, our lifestyles changed with industrialization and urbanization. And with that, you have the rise of funeral directing as something that can be sold, something you can make your living on. And cabinet makers realized they could sell casket making as another revenue stream of their carpentry skills. And then you had the invention of the Memorial Park Cemetery, which is kind of it's something we can sell with all the trappings as the economy was becoming less and less agrarian. So the funeral and cemetery industry would be just fine if we all forgot that we have this ancestral knowledge of how to care for the dead in our community, of how to care for our own elders in their passing, because they do better when we walk into the funeral home or to the cemetery arrangements office with no prior knowledge and just take their word for it. Yep, this is what you need. This is what I'm going to do for you. I promise, Mrs. Smith, I'm going to make this as easy as possible for you and your family. We want the way to be eased, and a professional is a good way to cut some of the corners on all of the things you would have to learn and make decisions about. But they're making their money off the margin when they sell the bigger casket, the bigger flower arrangement, the more protective vault. And so there's been a little of a lost sight of the fact that community-powered death care is what humans invented before they invented all of that stuff. And there's a lot of healing benefits to kind of doing it the more natural way. It is more environmentally friendly because we don't have to buy all the extra stuff that has to be manufactured and shipped all around. So it is greener, but the experience that we have of going through a loss like that is also very different. And I think that's a big reason people are choosing it.
That's really interesting. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there are these unintended consequences of how society evolves on how they go about their day to day. So before the Civil War, traditionally, a lot of burials were done either on the family farm, in the back lot, in the remote area. It was done by barbers, even people who cut your hair, the barber surgeon. And as people moved in the city, like you said, less room. Now we don't have room. We don't have the family plot anymore. We have to figure out where to put the bodies. And It just evolved with carpenters, like you said, to the local cemetery. And it's neat to think that there's this return now through the Green Burial Council, through what you're working on with the Colorado Burial Preserve. It still is that people have urbanized. People have suburbanized. They don't have the ability or don't think that they have the ability, depends on local jurisdiction, of whether or not they can bury a loved one in their backyard. So it's almost as if you're returning back to basics, but still embracing the need of providing a space that people just don't have anymore. Is that right?
Yeah, let me just make a quick diversion into cremation here while we're on
Yeah.
history, because that's part of this story too of greater urbanization, professionalization, industrialization. It is related to geography. Certainly, if you live in the middle of the city, your options for where you could be buried in nature are questionable how much different people are willing to travel for something like that. So the rise of cremation is sort of in part to do with, gosh, we have all these people living in high concentration. What are we going to do with the bodies? And also in part to do with, gosh, when I went to that cemetery, they told me between the grave, the vault, the services, the tent and chairs on the day, it's going to be over $10,000. And in the meantime, none of that mowing the lawn, the watering, the fertilizer, gosh, none of that really fits with my values. So it seems that cremation might be the more practical, lesser resourced option. And certainly it is in most cases more affordable. But it has a big carbon footprint because of the natural gas that's burned to fire the retorts. It's a 1400-degree process for several hours. The gas to power a cremation, it's like a couple months of your daily driving. So yes, natural burial is in some ways a response that's sort of like, wow, I don't like the plastic grass that covers the earth at the fake cemetery. I mean, at the conventional cemetery, fake grass, real cemetery. I didn't like the way my embalmed loved one looked. I wasn't even sure why we needed embalming or what was the purpose of that. And on the other hand, it's against this trend we have in cremation. It's becoming more and more common for people to do nothing around when there's been a death. They just, it's a cremation, so we'll figure out about getting the family together, like maybe in springtime. And I don't know about this final resting place. I hate to take up a spot in one of those cemeteries. So we'll just bring the ashes home, which is not a permanent solution. And yeah, for me, natural burial is both kind of a response to the excess material waste and excess cost of conventional cemetery burial. But then it is also a response to doing too little around these immediate cremations. When we have burial, we have this opportunity to gather, to interact with the body of the loved one, to take part, as far as lowering with the straps and pallbearing and moving the earth with the shovels or just with your hands. So yeah, in some ways it's more than the funeral we've kind of come to know at the funeral home. And in other ways, it's a lot less from the one that they were hoping to sell us.
Walk us through that. What does a green burial look like for people that have no concept, and do a little bit of compare and contrast against the traditional burial that most people think of, the pallbearers with the straps and the coffin going to the ground?
In a lot of ways, it's the same because I call it a conventional burial. The industry says traditional burial, but I say the old way is even more traditional. I mean, this is as ancient as humanity, caring for each other in death. So, but even if your choice is a natural burial, you can still have as much or as little funeral service as you might want, as much or as little pomp and circumstance. A lot of people associate natural burials with home funerals or DIY death care, meaning the person dies at home, they're vigiled at home, and kind of family and community are the ones taking care of this. But that's not always the case at all, especially if the person has died in a facility, a hospital, assisted living. Yeah, a lot of people are going to assume, these institutions assume that you're going to call a funeral home, and going to a funeral home is not incompatible with not wanting embalming or being naturally buried. And once you are, the morticians can use the refrigeration in lieu of embalming to sort of keep the person's body condition stable. So we still, in most cases, have many of options for if we want to participate in washing and dressing and shrouding the person, if we want the people who were out of town to be able to spend one last time with them before the burial. if we want to have religious rites over the body. All of those are still totally possible. And then and the burial itself, when I make arrangements in Colorado Burial Preserve, I tell them, this is your day. We only get one. A lot of people have 2, 3, 4 weddings. We only ever have one funeral per person. So it's important to get it right. There is no second chance of getting it right. So, these funerals have been everything from, the family is bringing the loved one in the back of the car with the seats down, and they're just kind of dropping her off with no particular ceremony to it, to, the funeral home comes in the fancy car with the pastor in the second car, and the family gets out of a limousine, and we have the tent and chairs set up, and they commit their loved one to the earth with all of the trappings that you might expect from a conventional cemetery graveside service, other than the outer burial container. So I always encourage the loved ones to participate in the process to whatever degree they're comfortable and keen to do so. And that'll include pallbearing if they want to carry and lower their person. That includes returning the earth over the grave if they want to. I always encourage them to do at least a handful or a shovel to full, but there's been many times where the gathered loved ones will return all of the earth over the person and close the grave. At a conventional cemetery, they make you leave before they do that because it's not safe to bring in the backhoe with all the guests still around. But when it's a natural grave, it's a little shallower. We don't have the big heavy equipment. There's no crane needed for the vault lid. There's no downside to having the family and the gathered loved ones be right there, that hands-on with the process. And when they do stay to cover the whole grave, I plant the restoration seeds with them too. So Colorado Burial Preserve, we have a native habitat restoration mission, meaning the final resting place is planted with the beneficial native species to try to get a meaningful gift back to the earth that's going to protect biodiversity. And I invite the loved ones to do that process with me too, because I think it's very meaningful to kind of, send your loved one out with the blessings for the new generation and kind of take part in the fact that the return of this body to the earth is going to give life to future life forms in this spot that's being preserved for nature. So, I recommend that they participate with it in every way possible when that's the wish.
There's something really is that needs to be said about participation. When my father died, my grandfather died, I don't know what compelled me to do this, but it's now a tradition in my family that while we are having, the commercialized traditional funeral, Jewish funeral they have a vault, but you've got the the wood casket, very simple, shroud, whatnot within. We wouldn't leave until we at least covered the casket completely. And there was that finalization, and you're right, like we couldn't fill it all the way up. That would take hours to do with the shovels that they had. But having the first thump of dirt is emotional. That's the worst,
right? For
me at least. And then that last bit, when you can't see it any longer, there's a really emotional experience there. And it's hard to describe, but it matters.
So I mentioned I'm a student of religions and I'm trained to be a non-denominational life celebrant. And so I have learned that ritual is how we as humans sort of make sense of things that are bigger than us. Right? It's like too much to conceptualize all at once when there's been a death. Firstly, adjusting to the loss. Secondly, be reintegrated into society in sort of a changed status as a bereaved family member. But by gathering and by these notable, a ritual is a repeated action done with intention. So the covering of the earth is a perfect example of it's just a simple physical act, but when you do it there in the moment, surrounded by your community, with whoever's leading the service, sort of telling you, this is why we do this, these are the symbolisms behind these actions. For me, it's an important step in the walk we have to take when there's been a death. And when we have a funeral that is lacking those opportunities for ritual, for me, it's a loss to think of those loved ones sort of having to do all this integration and conceptualizing and understanding of what they've just experienced in bereavement. without these sort of social benefits of gathering and taking part in ritual.
Absolutely. Let's shift a little bit. For people that are interested in learning a little bit more, there's an organization that you're a member of, Green Burial Council. Fantastic organization for people that are listening. We link to it from our Green Burial Hub, information hub on the Buried in Work website. Go find it, learn a lot. Can you help describe what GBC does and the scope of the members that you guys have in the organization?
The Green Burial Council has two missions. Firstly, we offer a voluntary credential for cemeteries, funeral homes, and pieces of burial merchandise, caskets and urns and shrouds that are suitable for natural burial. The cemeteries agree to follow sort of best practices around management of the cemetery, both for business responsibility and for environmental stewardship. And the funeral homes commit to being open to green burial, that they are prepared to furnish this type of necessary, they're ready with shrouds and biodegradable caskets, and that they would not require embalming for sort of different memorial activities you might want to do with your loved ones. So this is a voluntary credential for companies around death and dying to say, you know what, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to apply for this gold standard to show that I'm not just using kind of green themes in my marketing, but that I'm truly, applying industry standards for how to be sustainable and friendly to natural death care practices. The other mission of the Green Burial Council is education to the public. I've found that a lot of people don't even know that this type of disposition, this type of burial is an option for them. But like the experience I had, an aha moment, as soon as I found out about it, I knew that was something I would want for myself and my loved ones. So the more we can educate the public, these are your options. These are what questions you ought to be asking at the funeral home. These are the locations you might want to look to if you're seeking a final resting place like this. We can make the industry more sustainable, by which I mean we can reduce the overall environmental toll of death and dying as we increase the prevalence of natural burial. Firstly, the options, and secondly, the people seeking the options, because really under capitalism, it's market forces that will drive the funeral and cemetery industry to embrace this type of thing. So it's a two-pronged approach with the GBC of making sure the industry is ready for this consumer demand that we're seeking to promote.
I love it. Emily B. Miller, this has been tremendously helpful for people that are interested in learning more about green burial. If you're interested in it and you want to learn a little bit more, greenburialcouncil.org. Also, you can find Emily at coloradoburialpreserve.com. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. Emily, thank you so much for the time today.
I'm so happy to do it.
All right.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Buried in Work podcast. Remember, you can save 10% on our estate preparation package and games with code podcast10 at buriedinwork.com.